Okay.
And I'm going to mute myself.
We'll get started. Okay, my name is Roy DeBerry. Today is Thursday, March the 11th, 2021. I'm joined, of course, by April Grayson, who is doing the camera work for us today, and she's also with the One Institute, and also Catherine Kilgore, we call her Jenny, who is with the North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, may be retired now, but I don't think so. She's also an elder law expert. This is about North Mississippi Rural Legal Services Oral History Project, 50 years of service. What an achievement. Today we are honored to have with us John Maxey, who was an attorney, and he'll tell us more about that with rural Mississippi some time ago, and also was an attorney in Jackson, Mississippi for a number of years. I have known John for a number of years, and I'm just delighted that I have an opportunity today to interview him. And I'm sure he will share some things with me and the audience, and for the future, some things that I didn't know about. So John, I guess I want to start with just sort of a bio, and that is basically where were you born, where did you grow up, something about your background, work, education, and who had the greatest influence in your life. So I guess I'll just start with the basic, where were you born, where did you grow up, and where did you go to school?
Interesting, my father was not a college graduate, and when World War II came along, the Air Force in its, or the Army at that time, in its arrogance, thought you had to have a college degree to fly an airplane. So he was among a class of recruits that was taken to Texas to train to see if they could learn how to fly an airplane. Of course, a monkey can fly an airplane in those days anyway. And so he was in Harlingen, Texas, and that's where I was born. So I'm a Texan by birth.
Long stop. We won't hold it against you.
Thank you. I keep that a secret most of the time. But anyway, he finished his service in World War II, and we ended up, he decided to go to mortuary school in Nashville, Tennessee. And so we lived there as youngsters, my sister and I, and we, I mean, you know, we're living with a bunch of other soldiers that had just been discharged from the service. And it was, I mean, our do not eat Jell-O today, because my mother fed us Jell-O almost every meal because we just didn't have enough money to buy other kinds of food. But Jell-O, she thought was you know, nutritious. So we that's what we had. Anyway, my father, to get his license to practice as a funeral director, he went to Holly Springs, Mississippi to be an apprentice for a year. And we ultimately moved to New Albany, Mississippi, where he acquired a funeral home, and I was raised and educated at the public schools in New Albany. Then ultimately, after that, went to the Naval Academy and spent a couple of years until I had some health problems and I just couldn't pass the officer's physical, and transferred to Ole Miss. Finished there and finished law school at Ole Miss in 1968.
Okay, you mentioned father and then connected to the service and then getting involved with the funeral home business. But what about your mother? I mean, you mentioned the fact she did Jell-O. Where was she? Where did she?
Well, she grew up in Iuka, and after high school went to Florence State Teachers College. Actually, I'm wrong. She went to Wood Junior College, which is down in Mathiston, Mississippi. And that's where she met my father. His father was a minister, Methodist minister, and Wood Junior College was a Methodist school, and so he was the minister to that school, and my father therefore could go to school without having to pay tuition. My mother, after leaving that school with a degree, went to Florence State Teachers College, which is, I think, the University of Alabama, Northwest Alabama now, in Florence, Alabama. And she ultimately got her doctorate at Ole Miss and taught at the university and the School of Education until she retired. And she's deceased now. Both my father and mother are deceased.
So basically, you are basically from the hills. I mean, Iuka, New Albany, and I know you spent some time in Nashville, which is also part of the hills as well. So
Right.
contrary to a lot of people, all people of European ancestry don't grow up in the Mississippi Delta, and they're not all from the aristocracy.
That's right. We were really rednecks, and I remember that was proven amply by when I came to Ole Miss and I'd see an attractive woman that I'd want to date, and I'd ask her something about her, and she would always say, "My daddy's a farmer." Well, I later found out that was the owner of a plantation. And I didn't get many dates after they found out I was a redneck. So
that's always an interesting piece. So basically, when you were growing up, you met your mom, dad, there may have been others, but who would you say had the greatest influence on that early life, your early development?
I think it was my mother. She was a really a strong personality and liked things done in order, in an orderly way. And so that's sort of how I got my influence. Her mother was a teacher, and her mother's father was a minister, a circuit rider in the Methodist Church up in North Mississippi. So we sort of come from a line of people that were in a professional capacity.
So basically, you mentioned Ole Miss, and I take it you got your undergraduate degree and law degree from Ole Miss.
That's right.
And so when did you choose, when and why did you choose to work for North Mississippi Rural Legal Services?
Well, it was a time of upheaval. I guess we can say that about almost any era in history. But I was at Ole Miss. I had transferred in from the Naval Academy in '62, which you recall was the year that James Meredith entered the university, and that became a very influential time for me. It was a disruptive time. We were seeing the rise of the civil rights movement was in its heyday, really, from early '60s, as you know, on into the late '60s, and that influenced me considerably. And when I went to law school, curiously, the faculty had invited some sort of young, enthusiastic Northeast law graduates, Yale graduates that came into the university to teach, and a couple of those were very influential on me, particularly in my interest in the rights of workers. I took a lot of labor law in law school, and that was sort of what I aspired to do when I practiced law, ultimately, was to represent workers and unions and related parties.
Who was the executive director at the time when you did the work with North Mississippi Rural?
It was a program that was really funded as a clinical program to the law school. So it had sort of a committee that ran it. Michael Trister was the nominal director at the time, and the person most influential probably on my career. And we worked together and I was in the clinical program while a law student. And then once I graduated and became a member of the bar in 1968, I had just sort of gravitated to the legal services program. I interviewed some law firms in Jackson, and it just fell flat. I just either I fell flat or they fell flat. But I was just not interested in that. I was really interested in changing the way the society was operating, and I thought legal services was one way of doing that.
Gotcha. So you mentioned Mike Twister. What kind of, was he a Southerner? Was he Northerner? I know you mentioned the clinical program. So what kind of person was he?
He was he had graduated from Yale and was from Connecticut, as I recall. I think he and John Britton, who was another lawyer that had worked with the North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, knew each other. And Michael was, he was probably a couple of years older than I was as a professor and I as a student. So we were able to be friends and social friends, as well as, a student and professor. And he, we did a lot of disruptive kind of litigation. We didn't seem to be fall into the mold of just doing divorces and adoptions, and so it really created a great deal of dissension with the bar and the politicians of Mississippi, and Michael and his colleague George Strickler, who was also on the faculty and who were running the clinical program at North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, were fired from the faculty, and they sued the law school for firing them, and ultimately got reinstated into the position and on the faculty.
So y'all were real rebels. So you mentioned 62. Reuben Anderson, what year did Reuben Anderson come into the law school? I believe he and Connie were.
Slaughter.
Yeah. Were they at around the same time, or was Connie after Reuben?
Well, she was younger and came after. Let's see, he came in probably 69, Roy.
Okay.
And she came probably in 70.
Okay.
No, she came in 69 also, but he was a year ahead of her. That's
okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I was just curious. I know she likes to say she was the first Black female graduate of the university, and I think Reuben may have been the first African American graduate male. Is that correct? Okay. Jenny, you want to chime in at this point? Jenny may have some questions.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah. I was just curious about the approach that Michael Twister took to how the legal services was conducted then. As I understand it, throughout the country, different programs kind of proceeded in a different way. What would you say his philosophy was?
I'm not sure we had anything that governed our attitude about things. We had, we were all a product of the times, meaning that, the civil rights movement across the country had really come to fore, and we had these young law professors from Yale who were, were interested in seeing what things could happen and how things could be developed. And they wanted to use the legal services program. I don't think use is a good term. I think they wanted to see the legal services program train lawyers to do something other than, just going into corporate law. And I felt like I was a product of that among some others. And that's, I think, if I could identify some governing philosophy, it would be that.
Okay. Which counties did you work in?
Well, I was the first lawyer admitted into practice in Mississippi that practiced with North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. And so they sent me to Holly Springs, Roy's hometown, and
Our hometown.
yeah, to straighten out Holly Springs. And let me tell you, that was a tall order. And I have to confess that I was absolutely about as green a lawyer as you can be going into the shark pool of Holly Springs. There were no black lawyers there at the time. There were the white lawyers just literally were treated me rude. I was threatened from time to time by the circuit judge. Didn't particularly like me, and he would threaten me with contempt and jail and so forth. And I was young enough to be impetuous and really unafraid, but old enough, I think, to realize that going to jail was not going to be much of a solution. So I tried to, go between the two extremes. So Holly Springs was not a very hospitable place to practice law initially. And I did what most young lawyers do when they start out is I knew how to do divorces and adoptions and do some land work. But, the thing, if you can put yourself back in that time, the African-American citizens of any area in the South had a pent-up desire for just common run-of-the-mill legal services like adoptions, like divorces. I mean, people had been apart for years and years and never gotten a divorce, and they had children in their house that they wanted to, make their own, and so they needed adoptions, and you had, minor land disputes and fence arguments and things like that a lawyer can help with, but no white lawyer had ever been willing to do it. They all said that they were, and they would do pro bono work, but that was just not true in reality. So that's what I started out doing, and then eventually realized that we weren't going anyplace, and I started filing some school desegregation suits, and that was that really spoiled the well. I mean, nobody was very happy with that on the white side of things, and the black citizens were pretty nervous about a young white guy from New Albany representing them. And I say that in a sense that, you have to trust your lawyer. And if you're a black citizen in 1968 or 69 in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and you've got a white lawyer that's leading you into a school desegregation case, you need a heck of a lot of trust, because he or she might be leading you right into the devil's den, so it was a learning experience in that I had to try to develop the trust of the clients that I was representing, and had to learn what that trust meant. I mean, trust wasn't just something where, you can turn your back on somebody and they won't steal from you. Trust is having the judgment to give them advice that would not get them in trouble, but in fact would offer them some solutions.
Okay. We mentioned Holly Springs, and so basically, I take it, who were some of the blue blood lawyers in Holly Springs? I probably remember some of those names just from my childhood. The one that didn't take so kindly to you.
Well, there was a guy named John Kennedy who practiced law, who was in the legislature. There was I'm drawing blanks on other lawyers, and I may come back to that later.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, I knew John Kennedy. Matter of fact, he was trying to finagle some property that my parents had paid for anyway. So
He was a finagler.
yeah. So I know him. Smooth operator though, very, charming and all that.
Yeah, he was
Yeah.
in the legislature
Yeah.
and was known for getting the common law marriage declared unlawful, which is, I'm not sure that was a good thing, but that was what he was known for.
Yeah. And there's another personal side to him, but we'll discuss that off stage.
Yeah.
Skip Robertson, Stan Taylor, Henry Boyd. Did you know them?
Oh, yeah.
Been in a relationship with them?
Yeah, I roomed with Stan Taylor until I got married, and my wife made him move out. And then Henry Boyd worked, in our office at Legal Services as a paralegal, and was really a good man. I mean, somebody who was sincere and dedicated to doing good work and helping his clients effectively.
To your knowledge, was that the first time? And I knew Boyd, his dad was my high school and elementary school teacher, Henry Boyd, because he was a junior.
That's right.
Did this change them having involvement like that with rural North Mississippi Rural Legal Services? Did that change the lives of some of those paralegals at that time in your judgment? I know Henry brought those to the table, but did he also learn a lot that he could carry on with?
I think so. It's one of those things, almost back to the subject of trust, is learning to be confident in the society that you're operating. And I think, when you're raised to be, sort of battered and pushed around like most African-American youngsters were in those days, just learning to be confident in yourself was a major accomplishment. And I think Henry evolved in that way.
Mm.
You may recall a guy named Skip Robinson.
Yes.
Who was just a heck of a guy. I mean, just a man of great principle, I thought, and was a brick mason. So he had sort of an independent way of making a living.
Plus, they own land out in Rock Park and Red Banks. Their whole family owned a lot of land out there, and they were very independent. Very independent. You're absolutely right.
And I think Skip eventually became converted to Islam.
Correct.
And he, I know it's not funny, but he changed his name to Skip X, which I thought was a sort of an odd name. But he was I say a friend. He maintained his distance, but I thought of him as a friend.
Yeah, and he tells the story. We interviewed his brother James, and he's featured as we are featuring you, and he talked about some of his experiences that Skip had as a brick mason and some of the work that he did down at the University of Mississippi, and but that's a whole nother story as well. So, if you talked about some things, describe the relationship between North Mississippi Rural Legal Services and a local community. Can you cite some examples? You may have already addressed some of this, but and what was the role of, we just talked about Henry Boyd, who was a paralegal, and some other non-attorneys on the staff. Just that relationship between the organization and the community, or was there one at that point? Was it yet to be built?
Roy, we just never could develop much of a relationship. And I hope that's developed since I left a long time ago, because, well, to start with, I was immature and I didn't understand that that's something that really needed to be developed. I sort of wanted to see a problem and find the solution. And sometimes those things need to develop. For example, we thought we could sort of wean some of these hardscrabble farmers from cotton. I mean, they were planting cotton on the hillside and it wasn't making much, and there wasn't much market for it. And so we got a a pickle factory that agreed to take all of the pickles that we could raise and develop them. And I thought we could expand that as to become a, you know, a sort of a community development. And it just didn't work because I didn't understand. And it was just beyond me that you had to have a culture change. People don't leave what they've been doing for a long time and know how to do it and just suddenly change and do something else because it seems like a good idea. So that's the best example I can think of as one of the things I consider a failure of my time in Holly Springs, of not being able to understand that culture change is necessary and it's not something that happens instantly.
Right. You mentioned earlier, and I didn't get a chance to follow up on that. Maybe Jenny had alluded to it in this case involving Marshall County and others that had to do with it. What was the outcome of that case?
Well, we ultimately won the case in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And so all of the schools were made unitary. And of course, I was told by the superintendent of the Holly Springs school when I filed a suit, he said, you know, do you want to see all the whites leave the school system? And I said, well, that's not my objective, but you can't have an unconstitutional school system sitting here and expect it to ever succeed. Well, when we won the case ultimately, and it was, the schools were declared to be unitary, then of course all the whites did leave.
With the Marshall Academy?
Yeah. And so he was right in that regard, but you can't have an unconstitutional public school system and consider that a part of your society, I think.
And I guess I would argue, and you would argue as a lawyer, that it was separate but not equal.
It really was. I mean, it was just, it was about as classic an example as you could have of, the textbooks were used and dog-eared.
I went through that system.
Not enough of them. I mean, and the poor teachers were products of the system that they were teaching in, and so they didn't have a very good education, and they couldn't handle the challenges in front of them. I mean, I can't tell you, Roy, the problems.
That's right. I think you describe it so well. Because I mean, I went through that system that you just described, the books, the facilities, you name it. So what you did was absolutely necessary, and it's no control of what the outcome is going to be. It's almost like the situation Johnson, said back in '65 when the Voting Act was passed, that if this passed, then we're going to lose the South, and that happened. But you still had to do what you had to do because Black folk had been denied the right to vote and had every right under the Constitution to get that right. So thank you for that. Thank you for that effort. Jenny?
I was wondering about the problems that we've had in this state for a long time, but about the resistance to federal help for people who, are low income. And did any of your litigation or advocacy issues have to do with trying to promote public benefits for the poor against the resistance of the establishment in Holly Springs?
Yeah, and I think that's where we saw some success with people like Henry Boyd Jr. working in the office. He became a conversant in the rules and regulations of welfare, which was just miserably poor at the time, but it was what some people sustained themselves on, some families lived on, and so Henry was pretty good at developing relationships with the welfare people who were not all bad, and they wanted to succeed too, I think. And Henry was able to help some people along the way gain some benefits from the welfare, having been turned down for various reasons. And without getting into all of those details, it just seems to me that that was one of the successes that we had.
Yeah. Were you and Mike Trister and I guess Stan Taylor involved in any litigation on those issues that you can recall?
You know, I think so. And, you know, Jenny, I can't recall. I remember the first time I appeared before the Mississippi Supreme Court, it was in a case that involved that issue where the Board of Supervisors of Marshall County had ruled some fashion that denied people the benefits of welfare arbitrarily and hadn't done it properly. You know, they either didn't have a quorum when they voted or something technical like that. And so I ended up arguing. That was my first case in the Supreme Court, and it was in the Supreme Court chambers were at that time in the existing Capitol building. And it was and I think Michael Trister really was my mentor in sort of helping me get ready for that argument. And I recall the acoustics in that room were just miserable. And one of or two of the judges sitting on the Supreme Court panel, there were three of them on the panel, couldn't hear either. And so here I'm talking to these three judges, and they had no idea really what I was saying. And, and so I can't remember. I think we won the case. Since I can't remember, it's better to say I won it than lost it. But that was a long time ago.
Yeah. I was just curious. I think you're cited in maybe Chris Shepard's book, Rationing Justice, as being one of the sort of, even though you say you were born in Texas, one of the native son lawyers who came in, and it was kind of uplifting to see this group of local lawyers begin to take up the banner of access to justice, I guess. And so I was wondering what kind of pressures you might have worked under because of that, having to be on the cutting edge like that.
Well, Jenny, it's, I'd like to romanticize it, but I really can't, because I was young and full of energy, and I didn't care what was in the way. I was going to get past it. And I had some physical threats. I got some guy, I guess, probably the same person would call and say, when you start your car on your way home, it's going to blow up. And I frankly, can't even recall whether I had any fear. I think I had the attitude that I'd get in and start it, and if it blew up, then it blew up. If it didn't, I was okay. But I think and I didn't worry about money at that time. I just was newly married and we just didn't worry about money. I mean, so that couldn't be a pressure to be exerted. My mother was very supportive. My wife's mother and daddy were not very supportive, but they didn't disown her or anything. So we had a little bit of pressure there. And the thing that I missed, and Roy would understand this from Holly Springs, I think, is one of the benefits of practicing law is you have a camaraderie with the other lawyers. because you don't know everything, and you can go talk to some of those lawyers and find out. They'll help you out. That's just part of that just didn't happen in Holly Springs. They were not very cooperative at all.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I graduated from law school in '75 and did some employment discrimination cases and some other personal, civil rights matters in private practice. And by then, legal services was so established that I would go down and get training from Alvin Chambliss about how to go to federal court.
Yeah,
So,
right.
by then, it had turned to where we were looking to legal services to help us, at least those who are trying to do that kind of work in private practice. So,
Yeah.
anyway, let me turn it back to Roy for a minute, because both of y'all can describe Holly Springs as it was then.
Well, I think he's done a good job of describing the early Holly Springs, which considered itself the blue-blooded capital of the Northeast Mississippi. It was not from the Delta, but it thought it was a part from the Delta. In many of the ways that that blue-blooded Holly Springs was a different animal. John, let me ask you. You mentioned, coming off of the law school, being a Southerner, being one of the first Southerners to be engaged. I recall that as my involvement with SNCC, even as a young person, that one of the things that we talked about in meetings was the need for Southern whites to be engaged in the struggle. And there were very few, but the few that got engaged, they were considered to be the scum of the earth. And I would assume, based on what you just said earlier, since you were Southerners, particularly from New Albany, mixing up with these rabble-rousers, that would explain some of that kind of venom that was manifested against you. Would you say that would be true for you?
I guess so. Roy, I can't recall that I had any reaction like that, because I really thought, as I said, I was young and energetic, and I just, if something got in my way, I didn't let it worry me. I just tried to either go over it or around it or through it. And so I didn't, I probably didn't spread my wings far enough to really include some of the things that would have brought me into that conflict.
Gotcha. So you were doing something for the cause, but also being very diplomatic as well.
I think that's part of my personality too, is I didn't like to just be ugly and disreputable to people. And I guess that's the way I was brought up in my home. And so it probably served me well, even with people who were otherwise hostile. If you weren't hostile back to them, they tended to at least ameliorate some of their anxiety. And so I was able to probably get through some things a lot easier than some other people might have.
Gotcha. I would assume also you mentioned your mother and father being Methodists. I would wonder whether or not that old Methodism would have had some dealing with the way you related to people.
Yeah, actually, the lessons I learned going to Sunday school were the lessons that I still live by, which is that, sort of treat other people as you would like them to treat you, sort of a fundamental Sermon on the Mount kind of lessons. And that was a real benefit, I think.
Good. Well, it's interesting that you put that in practice, because some of my good friends and brothers don't do that. Can you describe, I know you're young and you right out of law school, but ways that North Mississippi Rural Legal Services served as a training ground, not so much for you, but for the students perhaps that came, I don't know how many came during your time and how many came after you left, and you may not know very much about that, but would you say that that was a somewhat of a training ground? I know you left and eventually went to Jackson, so, and to do practice, private practice. Was it a training ground for you?
It was, and let me be more specific. I actually left North Mississippi Rural Legal Services to go to Jackson to start a legal services program there because
Okay, yes, yes. Let's talk about that a little bit.
it was the largest city in the country without a legal services program, and the bar was just closed about. I mean, they wouldn't entertain any kind of legal services program in Jackson, and so a group of people. Good young lawyers formed a committee and said, let's start a legal services program. And we, so I interviewed for it and took the position. I was the only lawyer there for a while. And we got a field foundation grant to start the program until we could get a OEO grant for a legal services program. And we stayed alive for a couple of years before we got that program. Jackson State had I'm sure you recall the event, but there was a riot at Jackson State where there was a young man killed.
Actually, two, 1970.
That's right. That's right. And
matter of fact, one of the young men that was killed when I lived in Jackson, his brother was my next door neighbor.
I'll be, yeah, well,
Green.
Yeah, Green. It was, that was a time of great tumult, and right after the Kent State shootings, and President Nixon, who was, not known for much of anything, decided that signing the Legal Services Corporation bill into effect would be sort of a bone that he could throw to the to the Black community, if not the sort of the liberal community. So that's when the program got funded ultimately. But let me I digress a bit.
No, that's good.
I think that the most important thing that the legal services program did in its early days was to employ Black lawyers, Black law students coming out of law school, becoming lawyers, getting a little bit of training. I mean, certainly I wasn't experienced, but I had a couple of years on some of those guys, and I could give them the benefit of what I'd learned. And so then they could, after a while, go off and open their own practice and become role models. And some of them are now judges, So that was important. Another aspect of the same thing was that the legal services program had created a fellowship where it's called the Reginald Heber Smith Fellowship. And that was to employ Black lawyers to basically come into legal services programs and then eventually evolve into, their own independent private practice and it was a way of feeding into the bar some Black lawyers that virtually just didn't exist at the time.
So, you mentioned the Jackson, setting up the Jackson office there, and then the funding that came from the Nixon administration. There were, in my judgment, at that time, there was a few Black lawyers in Jackson when you got there. I don't know how many, maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 at the most.
Maybe 5, yeah.
Okay. Was there a relationship between the Lawyer for Civil Rights Committee? Did you have any involvement with that group?
Yeah, we were close. I mean, that was sort of the first exposure I had to really good lawyers that would talk to me. And that was President's Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, now later became the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. But President Kennedy had started that program. And then the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee, which was a little more aggressive. And they were all on Ferry Street. And then Reuben and Fred came in under the auspices of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund.
Mm-hmm.
And so all 3 of those groups were there on Ferry Street So they were very influential, not only on the practice that I was involved in with legal services, but they were, doing some Voting Rights Act litigation that was really just very important.
And Jenny can have a question in a second. So at that time, I know later on they stopped doing litigation. Was the organization there in Jackson still engaged in litigation? You still could legally do litigation?
I did it probably in disregard of the regulations until really the Legal Services Corporation came to be I think in 74, 75.
Mm-hmm.
And once I perceived, with all due respect, Jenny, I perceived that it was going to become more like a post office. And that's not what I wanted to do. So I left. That's when I went into private practice.
Gotcha. Jenny?
I was just curious, what did you think the area would have, what kind of difference did you think legal services made to, how would things have been different in Mississippi if we had not had the program?
Man, that's a hard question, Jenny. That really is a hard question. I'm more of a destiny person, and I believe that it was time for things to change, and they were going to change whether I did something or somebody else did something, or legal services existed or didn't, or Michael Trister stayed in Connecticut, or so I have maybe it's an abiding faith that things are going to change for the better, and that we can make a contribution, but we're not going to be responsible for it ultimately.
What kind of difference do you think it made in your life to have been part of it?
It probably was a major difference, because it gave me an outlet for some just overflowing emotional commitment to improving the culture I was in. So that was a legitimate outlet. I might have been otherwise on the streets with Roy, with Snick, burning cars or throwing Molotov cocktails or doing something, and probably wouldn't have survived. But it gave me a structure that I needed to try to accomplish what I felt like I needed to do.
So,
Go ahead, Jenny.
do you think, in not wanting to put words in your mouth, but what you just described is what I understood Lyndon Johnson really kind of, his Great Society program had in mind, and sort of beginning that program to give people an option of going to court instead of taking other kinds of action. Are you saying you think that was successful?
Yeah, my concept of what the Office of Economic Opportunity was, it was economic and community development for minorities, African Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and the legal services was almost an adjunct that was thrown in, and it was, if you've got a community organization, you need a lawyer. You always got to have a lawyer, and I think that's what happened. That's the way legal services was sort of created, was as an aid to community development.
I have just two. We're getting up on the hour. I have just two kind of final questions, John. One is a little bit, I guess, philosophical, in that you mentioned the law and people needing a lawyer. And then we also mentioned protest, the civil rights movement. And they are not mutually exclusive, although they have different goals. It seems to me that one sort of needs the other. I guess the question is, if people had not been engaged, had there not been a civil rights movement, and people were actively in the street trying to bring about change, do you think we would have had a North Mississippi Rural Legal Services group? In other words, like a chicken and egg question
Yeah.
that I'm asking.
And I think it is that I think North Mississippi Rural Legal Services really did serve as a precipitating factor for some other organizations. As you know, and I know from my upbringing, North Mississippi was pretty much isolated from development, and it needed,
Deliberately.
Yeah. And
Yes.
so I think the legal services program sort of was a little bit of a fuse that got some of those things started. I figure somebody like a Henry Boyd Jr. might not have had an opportunity to develop in the person that he ultimately became if he hadn't had the opportunity to work for legal services.
Could you say the same thing about, say, Skip Robinson, who had vocational background, but had not had the activist stuff?
Yeah, and I almost go back to this thing of you're building confidence. You're giving people the feeling like they don't have to walk to the other side of the street when they encounter a white person. And if you have that confidence, you can accomplish things. You may put yourself at risk sometimes, but you still accomplish things. And if you have confidence, you feel better about yourself. And if that spreads through the community, all of a sudden, people are going to stand up.
That's right. And I think speaking on a personal level, I think that was about what I was about, that I had the confidence that these barriers would not hold me back. What advice, again, you've been there, done this as a young person, and I'm not saying that people necessarily look for advice from our elder statesmen people, but I think all the time they ought to get it. What advice would you give young people today who might be motivated to make a difference, particularly in the legal profession, but maybe other professions as well? And there are a lot of issues out there now, as you had issues as a young man coming along in the 60s.
It's almost fundamental is believe what your insides are telling you. If you want to go to law school, you want to go there to help people. You don't want to go there to make a lot of money. Most people go to school of education to learn to teach. They want to teach people. They're not doing it for glory or grandeur. So I think it's if people were to listening to me, I would say listen to yourself and decide what is it you want to do and do it. Don't be influenced by these external things that are going to guide you into doing something you're probably not going to be that happy doing.
Wow. Well, I didn't believe that this has been great. It's been like an hour, unless Jenny has another question. Do you have another question, Jenny? We again, just on behalf of Jenny and April and this whole North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, and the fact that they are trying to put together this documentary and hopefully a book at some point. I think we just appreciate the fact that you and others have contributed to this history, and for our future, we think it's important for that history to be recorded, to be looked at, to be researched, to be examined by scholars and other people as we move into the future. So John, again, we just thank you for the opportunity to be with you today and to chat. And perhaps when I'm not on this Zoom call, I'll see you in Kroger or some other store in Oxford, and we can continue this chat.
So I really have enjoyed it myself. A walk back through some of those memories is a reminder of things. So I think,
Absolutely. And we appreciate that. And we want that story to be told. And we're glad you told some of that story. We know it's just a part.
thank you.
Thank you, John.
Okay.